Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are exploring the life of Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a woman who crossed the sea from a small German duchy to become Queen Consort of Great Britain and Ireland, who introduced the Christmas tree to England, who bore 15 children, and who watched as revolution swept through France and madness claimed the husband she loved. What was it like to be plucked from obscurity at 17 and married to a king you had never met? How did a young woman raised in the simple country fashion of minor German gentry navigate the glittering and treacherous halls of one of the world's great powers? And what remains of her now, more than 2 centuries after her death, in the gardens she tended and the traditions she brought with her across the water? We will trace the arc of her life from her birth in a provincial castle to her final hours at Windsor, from the girl who spoke no English to the matriarch who shaped a dynasty. We will walk through the rooms she decorated, sit in the gardens she planted, and stand beside her as history unfolded around her, as empires rose and fell, as children were born and buried, as the man she married slipped away from her into darkness. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you are here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I am glad you are with me. Now let us begin. The air in Mirow smelled of pine and wood smoke on the morning of May 19, 1744. Spring came late to Mecklenburg, that small duchy tucked into the northern reaches of the Holy Roman Empire, but when it came it arrived with a softness that eased the memory of winter. The castle at Mirow was not grand. It was solid stone, built for function rather than beauty, its walls thick against the cold that settled in from the Baltic each year. Inside those walls, in a room where light filtered through tall windows, Sophia Charlotte was born. She was the 8th child of 10, a middle daughter in a household already crowded with children and the modest bustle of country aristocratic life. Her father was Duke Charles Louis Frederick of Mecklenburg, Prince of Mirow. Her mother was Princess Elizabeth Albertine of Saxe-Hildburghausen. The titles were impressive, but the reality was simpler, quieter, less glittering than those words might suggest. Charles Louis was a second son. When his older brother inherited the duchy, Charles had been given the lower castle at Mirow and a small income. He raised his children there without ceremony or pretension. The rooms were comfortable but not lavish. Meals were plain and regular. The children played in gardens that spread toward the lake, ran through corridors that echoed with their footsteps, learned their letters from tutors who came from nearby towns. Charlotte grew up in a world bounded by forests and water. The lake stretched wide and dark beyond the castle grounds. In summer, swans glided across its surface, their feathers impossibly white against the deep green of the water. In winter, ice formed thick enough to walk upon, and the cold turned breath to mist. She would have heard the sound of oars in the morning when fishermen set out, the low call of birds that fish at dawn and dusk, the rustle of wind through the pines that grew thick along the shore. Her education was what you would expect for a daughter of minor German nobility. She learned a little botany, enough to know the names of common plants. She learned some natural history, enough to understand the rhythms of the seasons and the habits of animals. She learned rudimentary religion, enough to know her prayers and her place. She learned French, though not fluently at first, taught by tutors who spoke it with a German accent. Most of all, she learned household management. How to oversee servants, how to stretch a budget, how to preserve food for winter, how to organize the daily workings of a noble house that was comfortable but not wealthy. These were practical skills for a practical future. No one imagined that Charlotte would become anything more than the wife of a minor German prince managing his household much as her mother managed theirs. The rhythm of life at Mirow was steady and predictable. Seasons turned. Children grew. The castle smelled of beeswax and bread baking, of wool and wood smoke, of the particular mustiness that settles into old stone buildings no matter how often they are aired. In the kitchens there would have been the scent of roasting meat on good days, of barley porridge on ordinary ones. The floors were stone, cool underfoot even in summer, and the walls held the chill long after spring arrived. Charlotte was 8 years old when her father died. The loss was sudden, a rupture in the steady pattern of days. 6 months later, her uncle died as well, childless, and the duchy passed to her 14-year-old brother, Adolphus Frederick. The family left Mirow for the town of Neustrelitz, and everything changed. Neustrelitz was larger, more formal, a place where courtiers gathered and ceremony mattered. Adolphus Frederick was now Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, but he was still a boy, so their mother Elizabeth acted as regent. She ruled in her son's name, navigating the delicate politics of a small state surrounded by larger, hungrier powers. She allied with King George II of Great Britain. Mecklenburg bordered George's hereditary Duchy of Hanover, and the two German families had old ties, intermarriages, shared history stretching back generations. For Charlotte, the move to Neustrelitz opened doors that had been closed at Mirow. She was exposed to court life now, to the glitter and formality she had only glimpsed before. There were musicians at court, artists, poets. She heard harpsichord music drifting through halls, saw paintings hung in rooms where courtiers gathered, listened to conversation that ranged beyond the practical concerns of household management. She was tutored in French by a poet now, and her accent softened, her vocabulary grew. She learned to move through the rituals of court, to curtsy at the right moment, to know when to speak and when to remain silent. She watched her mother navigate the treacherous waters of Regency, saw how a woman could wield power carefully, indirectly, always conscious of the men who watched and judged. The air at Neustrelitz was different from Mirow. It carried the scent of ambition along with the wood smoke, the sound of intrigue beneath the music. But for Charlotte, still a girl in her early teens, it was also a place of beauty and possibility. She could walk in formal gardens now, not just wild woods. She could hear professional musicians, not just her siblings singing. She could imagine a future that stretched beyond the boundaries of a small German duchy. Across the sea in England, another story was unfolding. George, grandson of King George II, was coming of age. At 21, he fell in love with Lady Sarah Lennox, sister of the Duke of Richmond. She was beautiful and accomplished and entirely unsuitable. George's advisors warned him against marrying an English aristocrat. Such favoritism, they said, would be disastrous for domestic politics. Not since Henry VII had a British monarch taken a British bride. George wrote of breaking things off with Sarah, in words that carried the weight of duty pressed upon desire. "I am born," he wrote, "for the happiness or misery of a great nation, and consequently must often act contrary to my passions." It was a young man's attempt at nobility, at placing the needs of the crown above the wants of the heart. In 1760, King George II died, and his grandson became King George III at 22. The hunt for a royal bride intensified. His mother, Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, pushed him toward her own family, but George wanted something different. He wanted a wife who would not meddle in politics, who would not bring her own agendas and alliances to the throne. He wanted a wife who would be a companion, a mother to his children, a presence in his private life that remained private. It was then that 17-year-old Princess Charlotte caught his attention. Some stories say it was a letter she had written to Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, complaining about the conduct of his army, a letter eloquent enough that it gained notoriety and was widely published. But that letter, if it ever existed, has never been found. More likely, it was a story created by the palace. A bit of favorable publicity designed to make the unknown German princess more appealing to the British public. The truth was simpler. Charlotte appealed to George because she had been brought up in an insignificant duchy, far from the great courts of Europe. She had little experience with politics and intrigue. She would come to him without expectations, without a network of advisors and relatives demanding favors. She would, he hoped, be content to remain out of the public eye, to focus on their domestic life while he struggled with the business of ruling, and so the decision was made. George announced his intention to marry Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. He sent counselors to Germany to negotiate the marriage contract with her brother. They were received at Neustrelitz with all the ceremony the small court could muster. The men negotiated and signed documents that bound the lives of two young people who had never met. There were 3 days of public celebration before Charlotte departed, festivities that must have felt both joyous and strange, marking the end of one life and the beginning of another entirely unknown. Her mother had died just 1 month before. Charlotte left her homeland in grief, in trepidation, in whatever complicated mixture of hope and fear a 17-year-old girl feels when she is sent across the sea to marry a king. She would never return to Mecklenburg. Never again see the castle at Neustrelitz. Never walk beside the lake at Mirow. Never hear German spoken as the language of daily life rather than a private refuge. The journey was difficult beyond anything she could have imagined. It took 2 months. The ship encountered 3 storms at sea, and Charlotte, who had never been on open water before, was so violently seasick that when she finally reached the coast of England, she was bloated and exhausted. The diamond-encrusted wedding gown that had been prepared for her no longer fit. Seamstresses worked frantically to let it out while Charlotte tried to compose herself, to prepare for the moment when she would meet her husband for the first time. The bridal party made haste from the coast to London. They arrived at St. James's Palace on the afternoon of September 8, 1761. Charlotte met George and his family for the first time at the garden gate at 3:30 in the afternoon. Imagine that moment. The young king, shy and earnest, 23 years old, looking at the girl he had chosen based on reports and portraits. The young princess, 17, exhausted from 2 months of travel and sick from the sea, looking at the man who would be her husband in a matter of hours in a country where she did not speak the language. After a short respite to bathe and change into the altered wedding gown, the couple were married in a small ceremony in the royal chapel at 9 o'clock that same night. There was no long courtship, no gradual getting to know one another. They met at 3:30. They married at 9. By morning, Charlotte was Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. Just 2 weeks later, the new king and queen were crowned together in Westminster Abbey. The ancient ritual, the weight of the crown, the eyes of the nation upon them. Charlotte, who had grown up in a provincial castle, who had learned to manage a modest household, now stood at the center of an empire. The young couple were immensely popular in those early days. People lined the streets to catch a glimpse of them. When they went to the opera, the crowd pressed so close to their carriage, so desperate to see inside, that 4 people were crushed to death in the surge. It was a tragedy that cast a shadow over their early days, a reminder of the strange power they now held, the way their mere presence could cause joy and disaster in equal measure. Charlotte did not speak English yet, but George spoke German so they could talk to one another in the privacy of their rooms. He warned her early not to meddle in politics. He had watched his mother struggle to maintain influence at court, had seen how a woman's involvement in statecraft could become a source of conflict and resentment. Charlotte, who had watched her own mother navigate the difficult years of Regency, seems to have had no interest in political power anyway. She had seen the cost of it, the constant vigilance, the enemies made, the delicate balance that could tip so easily into disaster. The newlyweds got on well, better than well. Against all odds, matched by negotiation and married within hours of meeting, they grew to love each other. While George's grandfather and great-grandfather had been notorious for their mistresses, for their public infidelities and complicated romantic entanglements, George III remained faithful to Charlotte throughout their marriage. It was almost unheard of for a king, this quiet fidelity, this preference for domestic life over the pleasures of the court. George was relatively down to earth for a monarch. His subjects nicknamed him Farmer George because of his interest in agriculture and his preference for simple living. He was not fond of pomp and ceremony, did not enjoy the elaborate rituals of court life. He preferred plain food, sobriety, the comfort of family evenings to the glitter of balls and banquets. Charlotte, raised in a similar fashion at Mirow and Neustrelitz, found this suited her perfectly. Her personality was cheerful and outgoing in private, though she could be formal and dignified in public when the occasion demanded. She picked up English quickly, though she always spoke with a thick German accent that marked her as foreign even after decades in England. One courtier noticed that she was timid at first in company, but talked a great deal when she was among people she knew. She adored a good gossip, loved to hear the latest scandals and intrigues of London society, though she was careful never to involve herself directly. 11 months after their wedding, 3 months after her 18th birthday, Charlotte gave birth to her first child, George, Prince of Wales, the future King George IV. He was born at St. James's Palace, and his arrival was celebrated throughout the kingdom. An heir produced so quickly, securing the succession, but Charlotte's work was far from done. She went on to have a total of 15 children over the course of 21 years, 9 sons and 6 daughters. After George came Frederick William, who would eventually succeed his brother as King William IV. Then Charlotte, who married the King of Württemberg, Edward, who would father Queen Victoria, Augusta Elizabeth, who became Landgravine of Hesse-Homburg, Ernest Augustus, who became King of Hanover, Augustus Frederick, Adolphus, Mary, Sophia, Octavius, Alfred, and finally Amelia. Charlotte gave birth to her final child at the age of 39. Prince George and Princess Amelia had a 21-year age gap. The elder children were adults by the time the youngest was born. It was a state of near constant pregnancy that Charlotte found exhausting and frustrating. While expecting her 14th child, she wrote to a friend with unusual candor. "I don't think a prisoner could wish more ardently for his liberty than I wish to be rid of my burden and see the end of my campaign. I would be happy if I knew it was the last time, but it was not the last time." There was one more pregnancy after that, one more birth, one more child, added to the growing brood. Despite her complaints about the physical toll of constant childbearing, Charlotte loved her children dearly. Two of her youngest sons, Alfred at 2 and Octavius at 4, died of smallpox, and their loss was a grief she carried for the rest of her life. The rest of her children survived to adulthood, though her youngest daughter, Amelia, died of tuberculosis at 27. George and Charlotte were far more involved with their children than most royals of their era. George enjoyed tumbling around on the floor with his sons, playing games with them in the garden, telling them stories. It was a side of him the public rarely saw, this playful father who delighted in his children's company. Charlotte was more formal and strict, but no less caring. She made education a priority. Her sons were instructed by tutors, as was expected of princes, but unusually for the time, Charlotte hired well-educated governesses to teach her daughters as well. She wanted them to have more than she had been given, to know more than household management and basic accomplishments. The early years of Charlotte's marriage were complicated by her relationship with her mother-in-law. Princess Augusta paid members of Charlotte's staff to spy on her, to report back on what the young queen said and did in private. She insisted on rigid court etiquette that prevented Charlotte from making friends with British ladies. The queen was thus forced to rely on the companionship of the lady she had brought with her from Germany, which only made her seem more foreign, more isolated from English society. Augusta criticized Charlotte for not integrating into her new home, even as Augusta's own demands made that integration nearly impossible. It was a painful situation for a young woman far from her family, trying to navigate a new country and a new role. Charlotte must have felt the loneliness of it, the way she was watched and judged, held at a distance by the very people who were meant to welcome her. 4 years into the marriage, George suffered his first bout of mental illness. It was brief and not severe, but it was frightening. Princess Augusta kept Charlotte away from her husband during this time, kept her in the dark about his condition. Parliament, however, had learned its lesson from previous reigns. They passed a bill stating that if the king were incapacitated, Charlotte would act as regent. Augusta opposed the bill vehemently. She wanted to be named regent herself, to hold power in her son's name. But Parliament sided with the young queen, recognizing that Charlotte was George's wife and the mother of his children, that she had the greatest stake in his well-being and the stability of the throne. As George's love for his wife deepened, as their brood of children grew, Queen Charlotte gained more prominence at court. She gradually eclipsed her mother-in-law. When Princess Augusta died at 52, 11 years into George and Charlotte's marriage, it must have been a relief as much as a sorrow. The constant tension, the spying, the criticism, all of it ended. Charlotte was finally free to shape her own household, to make her own friendships, to be queen in fact as well as in name. When George and Charlotte married, the official royal residence was St. James's Palace, built by Henry VIII in the heart of London. George kept the court there, maintaining the formal rituals and public ceremonies. But he and Charlotte retreated to the suburban palaces of Kew and Windsor Castle for their private life. There they lived in a fashion that was almost bourgeois, at least by royal standards. The royal pair often strolled in the gardens together without an entourage, just the two of them walking side by side, talking quietly. Charlotte took a particular interest in developing the gardens at Kew, which had been started by George's father, Prince Frederick. The Queen had a passion for botany, a love of growing things that had begun in the gardens at Mirow and Neustrelitz. She added hundreds of new plant species to Kew, specimens brought from around the world by British explorers. Ships returned from voyages of discovery bearing not just maps and trade goods, but seeds and cuttings, living plants that had never been seen in England before. The South African bird of paradise, with its extraordinary orange and blue flowers, was named Strelitzia reginae in Charlotte's honor. It blooms still in hothouses and gardens, a living memorial to the German queen who loved flowers. Charlotte also collected a menagerie of exotic animals at Kew. She received a pair of South African zebras as a wedding present, and she added an elephant, kangaroos, and brilliantly colored parrots. The grounds must have echoed with strange calls: the trumpet of the elephant, the harsh cries of birds that had known jungles and deserts, the nervous stamping of hooves. She brought 2 Pomeranian dogs with her from Germany, Faux and Mercury, and she bred them at Kew. She gifted their puppies to favored courtiers, and thus popularized the breed in Britain. Her granddaughter Queen Victoria would keep Pomeranians as well, continuing the tradition Charlotte had begun. In 1762, George purchased Buckingham House for his wife as an even more remote family retreat. Charlotte adored the property, which came to be known as the Queen's House. Most of her children were born there, in rooms that smelled of beeswax and lavender, rooms where light came soft through tall windows. She expanded and redecorated the interiors at Buckingham House and at the Queen's Lodge at Windsor. Her taste ran to Indian wallpaper and bright colors, to rooms that felt warm and welcoming rather than cold and formal. Her style was described by contemporaries as dazzling, cheerful, and tasteful. Unfortunately, none of Charlotte's interiors survived. Her son George IV ordered extensive changes to Buckingham House after her death, transforming it into Buckingham Palace. It became the official royal residence under Queen Victoria and remains so today. The royal couple enjoyed the new concept of taking holidays to the seaside, and in doing so they popularized beach vacations among the British upper classes. The idea of going to the coast for health and pleasure, of breathing salt air and walking on sand, was novel and fashionable because the King and Queen did it. In 1768, Charlotte, North Carolina was named in honor of the British Queen. The county in which it sits is called Mecklenburg. The city is nicknamed the Queen City and boasts several statues of Queen Charlotte, even now, centuries after her death. In a country that broke away from her husband's rule, Her Majesty was renowned for treating her servants with great kindness. This was unusual enough to be remarked upon. She spoke to them with courtesy, remembered their names, inquired after their families. She was sympathetic to the poor and decided to make philanthropy the new public face of the royal family. This charitable aspect of monarchy, which seems so natural now, was in many ways Charlotte's innovation. She founded an orphanage and a maternity hospital, using her position to raise funds and awareness for those in need. She threw charity balls to help fund her projects, turning the social season into an opportunity for good works. The wealthy came to dance and be seen, and their entrance fees went to help the desperate. On May 19, 1780, George threw a ball in honor of his wife's 38th birthday. The event was a fundraiser for Chelsea Hospital, which cared for retired soldiers. But it was also the beginning of a tradition that would shape British society for nearly 2 centuries. The royals invited all unmarried noble ladies to be presented before Her Majesty in her drawing room at St. James's Palace. This was the first royal presentation of débutantes. The young women, daughters of the aristocracy, wore the finest court dress their families could afford. In the late 1700s, that meant wide mantua hoop skirts under gowns of colorful embroidered silk. Hair was piled high and decorated with 3 white ostrich feathers. The effect was spectacular and strange. These young women arrayed like exotic birds, curtsying before the Queen. In 1804, the Empire silhouette came into fashion, a high waist and a slim column of skirt, elegant and simple. But Queen Charlotte, who loved tradition and the fashions of her youth, insisted on hoop skirts. This led to some rather odd combinations, young women trying to blend the new style with the old requirements, their dresses a compromise between fashion and tradition. Queen Charlotte's Ball became the launch of the London social season, a rite of passage for the daughters of the aristocracy. This was the starting gun for their hunt for husbands, the moment when they officially entered society and became available for courtship and marriage. The Queen was an amateur matchmaker and suggested advantageous couplings for debutantes who especially impressed her, though she did not name anyone the diamond of the season. That would come later, in the Regency era and beyond. Charlotte pored over society papers, filled her letters to friends and family with all the latest gossip of London's upper classes. She was known as the Tom, a term for someone who loved gossip and intrigue without participating directly in scandal. Queen Charlotte's Ball continued until 1958, when Queen Elizabeth II announced she would no longer hold the ceremony. But debutante balls had spread by then, especially to the United States, where they evolved into a more democratic tradition. The high school prom is, in a sense, a distant descendant of Queen Charlotte's innovation, a moment when young people dress in their finest and celebrate their passage into a new phase of life. In the early 2000s, Queen Charlotte's Ball was revived in London. The program now includes classes on business skills, networking, etiquette, and philanthropy. Debutantes still curtsy, though now they curtsy to a giant birthday cake representing the long-dead queen, a surreal and touching tribute to a woman who began this tradition more than 2 centuries ago. Another of Charlotte's parties had an even bigger impact on British culture. In 1800, she arranged a Christmas ball. She invited all the children of Windsor to the Queen's Lodge, and they were astonished to see a whole decorated yew tree in the middle of the drawing room. This was the first English Christmas tree. The Tannenbaum is an ancient German pagan tradition, Christianized by Martin Luther in the 1500s, beloved in German-speaking lands but unknown in England until Charlotte brought it with her. Years earlier, every Christmas, she had decorated a single yew branch with the assistance of her ladies-in-waiting. The court would gather to sing carols and share gifts, and that decorated branch stood as a reminder of Charlotte's homeland, of Christmases at Mirow and Neustrelitz when she was a child. But in 1800, she decided to recreate the full tradition. A party guest described the scene with wonder. From the branches hung sweetmeats, almonds and raisins in paper, fruit and toys most tastefully arranged, illuminated by small wax candles. After the company had walked around and admired the tree, each child obtained a portion of the sweets and toys, and then all returned home quite delighted. The tradition spread from that one party. Decorated trees began appearing in other aristocratic homes, then in middle-class parlors, then throughout Britain and its colonies. Queen Victoria, Charlotte's granddaughter, would be photographed with her family around a Christmas tree, and the image would cement the tradition in the popular imagination. But it was Charlotte who brought it first, Charlotte who introduced this piece of German culture that would become so thoroughly British. The Queen enjoyed playing cards and horseback riding. She entertained the court with singing, her voice clear and well-trained, and with her skill at the harpsichord. She and George were both music connoisseurs with German taste. They favored George Frederick Handel, whose music was grand and formal and moving. Charlotte hired Johann Christian Bach, the youngest son of Johann Sebastian Bach, to be her personal music teacher. She was already accomplished, but she wanted to improve, to learn from one of the great musicians of the age. She hosted an 8-year-old Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart when he came to London. The child prodigy performed at the palace, playing complicated arrangements sight unseen, accompanying the Queen's singing of an aria. He later dedicated his Opus 3 to her, a set of sonatas composed for keyboard with violin or flute, music that still carries her name. As her daughters grew into adulthood, Charlotte became reluctant to allow them to marry. She wanted to spare them the agony of constant pregnancy, the risk of death in childbirth that hung over every woman of their era. She also wanted to keep them by her side, to maintain the close family circle that had been her comfort and her refuge. But her daughters grew restless. They called Kew Palace the nunnery, and longed to start lives of their own. Several of them had affairs with palace servants, dangerous liaisons that had to be hushed up. Only 3 of Charlotte's 6 daughters ever married, and only one had a child who was stillborn. The Princess Royal Charlotte married the King of Württemberg and became queen, but bore no children. Elizabeth married the Landgrave of Hesse-Homburg late in life. Mary married her cousin, the Duke of Gloucester. The other 3 daughters, Augusta, Sophia, and Amelia, never married. They lived at court under their mother's watchful eye, growing older without the families they had longed for, their chances at happiness slowly slipping away. Charlotte's sons were treated quite differently. They were allowed, perhaps encouraged, to be wild. The eldest, George, Prince of Wales, was given his own palace, Carlton House, at the age of 18. He threw himself into heavy drinking, gambling, and cavorting with mistresses. His annual allowance of £50,000, roughly $6 million in today's currency, was not nearly enough to keep up with his extravagant lifestyle. He frequently had vicious arguments with his parents. He secretly married a Catholic commoner, Maria Fitzherbert. The union was illegal without the king's permission and could have barred him from inheriting the throne if it had been made public and proven valid. The prince was deeply in debt. and his father refused to bail him out unless he left Maria and married a proper royal bride. George agreed, and his parents arranged a marriage to his first cousin Caroline of Brunswick. The couple met the day before their wedding, and unlike his parents, they hated each other on sight. The prince called for brandy the moment he saw her. Caroline stage whispered that he was very fat and nothing like as handsome as his portrait. They were drunk at the wedding, but they managed to do their duty and conceive a child. Charlotte, named for her grandmother, was born 9 months later. The newlyweds separated immediately after the birth. They could not stand to be in the same room. Queen Charlotte was put in charge of her granddaughter's upbringing. She doted on the girl, this bright and lively child who bore her name, and tried to give her the stability and love that her parents' bitter marriage denied her. Charlotte did dabble very carefully in politics, though she was always mindful of her husband's warning. Her primary interest was in German affairs, specifically in helping her brother, Duke Adolphus Frederick. She may have used her subtle influence to convince George to intervene in the War of the Bavarian Succession, a conflict that threatened the balance of power in the Holy Roman Empire. But she asked her brother to burn letters regarding politics, so that her husband would not be offended by evidence of her involvement. For the most part, Charlotte was uninvolved in the many tumultuous political events of George III's reign, and that was how both of them preferred it. George wanted to be an actual ruler, rather than a figurehead. He campaigned and poured money into political candidates who would support him. He broke up the political parties and installed prime ministers who would do his will, but he did not anticipate being blamed when things went wrong. He took an interest in agriculture and championed the Enclosures Act of 1773, which allowed wealthy landowners to fence off and claim common lands. These were lands that had been shared and farmed by communities for centuries. The act had the effect of concentrating wealth in the hands of a few and impoverishing the rest of the population. Families that had lived on and worked common land for generations were suddenly landless and desperate. Another of George's ideas was the Stamp Act, a tax imposed on the American colonies. The colonists were outraged. They had their own local governments and taxes and refused to pay tax to a government in which they had no representation. They declared independence in 1776. George sent his army to squash the rebellion, confident that British military might would quickly overwhelm what he saw as a ragtag group of malcontents. But after 5 years of guerrilla warfare, the colonists defeated the mighty Redcoat army. It was a humiliation for George and for Britain, a loss that would reshape the world. In need of a new penal colony to replace the lost American territories, Britain turned its sights on the recently explored continent of Australia. In 1788, the first fleet of convicts arrived at Botany Bay, the beginning of European settlement in a land that had been home to indigenous peoples for tens of thousands of years. That same year, George had another bout of mental illness, this time more serious and prolonged. He talked incessantly, words pouring out in a confused torrent. He foamed at the mouth and rampaged through the palace. His behavior was erratic and frightening. It remains unclear what caused his illness. Some historians believe he suffered from porphyria, a hereditary blood disease. Others think it may have been bipolar disorder or some other mental condition. Charlotte was terrified by her husband's outbursts. She asked to be moved to a separate bedroom for her own safety. She and their daughters went to see him daily, but the visits were incredibly stressful. The king would often hug them and refuse to let go, his grip desperate and painful. He had imaginary conversations with their dead sons, Octavius and Alfred, speaking to empty air as if the boys stood before him. Conflict arose between Charlotte and her 26-year-old son, George, Prince of Wales. She suspected him of trying to have doctors declare the king permanently insane so that he could claim the regency and the power that came with it. Omizakam suspected her of trying to have her own doctors declare the king sane so that George could name her regent instead. In the end, Parliament named the Prince of Wales as regent, but Charlotte as the king's guardian. It was a compromise that satisfied no one but preserved the appearance of unity. The king recovered after several months, though the shadow of his illness hung over the family. They all knew now that it could happen again, that the man they loved could be taken from them by forces they did not understand and could not control. Charlotte was a pen pal with Queen Marie Antoinette of France for many years. The British Queen was 11 years older than the French. Though the two consorts never met in person, they bonded over their shared love of music and art. They wrote to each other about their children, about the challenges of court life, about the strange isolation of being a foreign-born queen in a land not one's own. In 1789, the French Revolution broke out. The violence was shocking, unprecedented. The mob stormed the Bastille, and the royal family was eventually imprisoned in the Temple. Charlotte tried to instigate a plot to rescue her friend. She even prepared palace apartments at Windsor for the French royals, hoping somehow to bring them to safety in England, but the rescue never came. In 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine. Marie Antoinette followed him to the scaffold 9 months later. Charlotte was devastated. She mourned her friend and the brutal manner of her death. The French Revolution sent shockwaves through every royal house in Europe. If it could happen in France, it could happen anywhere. In 1798, Ireland rebelled against British rule. The uprising was defeated, and Parliament signed the Act of Union in 1800, making Ireland an official part of the United Kingdom. The country was renamed to reflect this forced union. By this time, George III was sinking into madness again, and this time he would not recover. He slipped further and further away, until the man Charlotte had loved and lived with for 40 years was lost to her. Watching him suffer was incredibly difficult. She avoided seeing him toward the end, unable to bear the sight of what he had become. Her own personality altered under the strain. She developed depression and a volatile temper. She no longer enjoyed appearing in public, not even at concerts, which she had once loved. Music, which had been such a joy to her, now seemed empty. She became addicted to snuff, powdered tobacco that was snorted through the nose. It gave temporary relief to her headaches, but it was a harsh and unforgiving medicine. Her relationships with her adult children became strained. They resented her control, her reluctance to let them marry and live their own lives. She resented their wild behavior, their affairs and scandals, the way they seemed determined to drag the family name through the mud. Charlotte found some solace in designing the interiors and gardens of a new residence, Frogmore House. It was a project she could control, a place she could make beautiful according to her own taste. She worked on it obsessively, pouring into the design all the energy she could no longer give to her husband. The Prince of Wales took over as Prince Regent in 1811. The period from 1811 to 1820 is known as the Regency because of this arrangement. The king was alive but incapacitated, so his son ruled in his name. Because the prince was estranged from his wife Caroline, Queen Charlotte acted as the First Lady of Court and hosted by his side. The prince was thrilled to finally have real power, but he spent most of his time bickering with Parliament and living extravagantly, while the rest of the nation suffered under austerity. During the Napoleonic Wars, he was deeply unpopular. The public saw him as vain, selfish, and wasteful. The country's hopes for the future were embodied instead in his only legitimate child, Princess Charlotte, the granddaughter Queen Charlotte adored. The young princess was beautiful and moderate in her habits. She and her handsome husband, Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, were the William and Kate of their day, beloved by the public, symbols of hope for a better future. But in 1817, Princess Charlotte died in childbirth at the age of 21. The entire nation mourned. Queen Charlotte, already worn down by years of grief and strain, was devastated by the loss of her beloved granddaughter. The princess's death was a disaster for the Hanoverian dynasty. Despite having 12 adult children, George and Charlotte did not have a single surviving legitimate grandchild. Several of their sons had children with mistresses, but those children were not eligible to inherit the throne. There was no one to become monarch in the next generation. It was a succession crisis. To avoid catastrophe, Parliament offered the princes cash incentives if they would leave their mistresses, marry foreign princesses, and produce a new generation of royals. One pamphlet of the time joked, "Hot and hard each royal pair are at it, hunting for the heir." It was undignified, this scramble to produce legitimate offspring, but it was necessary. The winner of this reproductive race was Charlotte's fourth son, Edward, Duke of Kent. He married a German princess and their daughter was born in 1819. Her name was Victoria, and she would become one of the longest reigning and most influential monarchs in British history. But Queen Charlotte never got to meet this granddaughter. She died on November 7, 1818, at the age of 74, 6 months before Victoria's birth. Her son, Prince George, was holding her hand when she passed. She had been Queen Consort for 57 years, the second longest tenure in British history after Prince Philip. King George III was so far gone in his madness that he was not told of his wife's death. He lived in a fog of confusion at Windsor, sometimes lucid, more often lost in a world of his own making. He died a little over a year later, on January 29, 1820, at the age of 81. He was laid next to his darling wife in the royal vault under St. George's Chapel at Windsor. They had been married for nearly 60 years. They had produced 15 children together. They had loved each other in a way that was rare for royals, whose marriages were usually matters of state rather than affection. Charlotte's legacy is complex and multifaceted. She introduced the Christmas tree to Britain, a tradition that spread throughout the English-speaking world. She began the tradition of royal presentation of debutantes, shaping the London social season for nearly 2 centuries. She made philanthropy a central part of the royal family's public image, a shift that continues to define the monarchy's role. She was a devoted mother who bore 15 children and raised 13 of them to adulthood. She was a faithful wife to a man who descended into madness. She was a patron of music and botany, of art and culture. She was a woman who tried to navigate the impossible demands of her position with grace, though she did not always succeed. In recent years, there has been interest in the question of whether Queen Charlotte had African ancestry. The idea stems from portraits painted by Alan Ramsay that give her somewhat African features, and because her ancestry has been traced to 13th century Portuguese King Alfonso III and his mistress Madrigana, who may have been a Moorish woman. It is a fascinating possibility, but the evidence is inconclusive. Portraits of the same person from this era often look wildly different, depending on the artist's style. And even if Madrigana was of African descent, she and Charlotte were separated by 500 years and 15 generations. Any African heritage would have been less than 1%. What we can say with certainty is that Charlotte was a woman who traveled far from home to marry a stranger, who bore 15 children, who introduced beloved traditions, who endured loss and grief, who tried to be a good queen, and a good mother and a good wife in circumstances that were often impossible. She lived through the loss of the American colonies, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars. She watched her husband descend into madness. She buried 2 young sons and a beloved granddaughter. She died before meeting the granddaughter who would carry her legacy forward into a new era. The gardens she planted at Kew still bloom. The Christmas trees she introduced still light up homes every December. The traditions she began still shape British culture. The Strelitzia Reginae, named in her honor, still unfolds its extraordinary flowers in houses around the world. When you stand in Windsor and look at St. George's Chapel, you can know that Charlotte rests there beside George. When you see a Christmas tree, you can think of that first one at Windsor in 1800, children gathering around it in wonder. When you hear Mozart's Opus 3, you can imagine an 8-year-old prodigy playing for a young German queen in a London palace. So the tale of Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz comes to us across more than 2 centuries. A minor German princess who became Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. A woman who crossed the sea and never returned home. A mother of 15 who watched the sea and never returned home. A mother of 15 who watched some of her children die and others waste their potential. A wife who loved a king and stayed beside him even when madness claimed his mind. What remains is this: a name in history books, statues in a city named for her across the ocean, flowers that bloom in her honor, traditions that have outlived empires, the soft sound of carols around a Christmas tree, the memory of gardens tended with care, the story of a life lived in service and in sorrow, in joy and in grief, in the strange and lonely splendor of a crown. The air at Windsor is cool in November, when Charlotte died. The leaves have fallen from the trees. The gardens sleep under frost. Inside the chapel, stone walls hold the silence. Outside, the world turns and turns again, seasons following seasons, years becoming centuries. And somewhere in all that turning, a young girl stands at a garden gate in Mecklenburg, looking at a lake that reflects the sky. She does not yet know she will cross the sea. She does not yet know what history holds. The water is dark and still, and swans glide across its surface, their feathers white as snow. The court at St. James's Palace moved according to rhythms that Charlotte had to learn, patterns of ceremony and precedents that had been established long before she arrived. There were levees and drawing rooms, formal presentations and state dinners. There were rules about who could sit in the Queen's presence and who must stand, about who could speak first and who must wait to be addressed, about what one wore and when and how deeply one curtsied. Charlotte learned these rhythms the way one learns a complicated dance, by watching and imitating, by making mistakes in private and then performing correctly in public. The palace smelled of beeswax candles and coal fires, of wool and powder and the particular scent of old stone buildings that have housed centuries of people. The floors were marble in the grand rooms, wood in the private apartments, always cool even in summer, always requiring slippers or shoes. In the mornings Charlotte would rise early. Her ladies would help her dress, a process that could take an hour or more depending on what the day required. The court gowns were heavy, stiff with embroidery and boning, requiring assistance to get into and out of. Her hair had to be arranged, powdered in her younger years, decorated with jewels or feathers depending on the occasion. She would breakfast simply, perhaps on bread and butter, tea sweetened with sugar, sometimes cold meat or cheese. George preferred plain food, and so the royal table was less elaborate than one might expect. There was fruit when it was in season, preserves made from the gardens at Kew, honey from the palace hives. After breakfast, if there were no official engagements, Charlotte would often retreat to her private rooms to attend to correspondence. She wrote letters in German to her brother, in French to other European royals, in English to British nobles and friends. Her handwriting was clear and flowing, her spelling erratic in all three languages, as was common for the time. She wrote about her children, about the weather, about books she had read and music she had heard. She gossiped about court scandals, about who was courting whom, about the latest fashions and the newest arrivals from the continent. Her letters reveal a woman who was observant and curious, who found pleasure in small details, who could be both generous and petty, kind and judgmental. When the weather was fine, she would walk in the gardens. At Kew especially, she spent hours among the plants, consulting with the gardeners, learning the names of new specimens, planning expansions to the growing collection. The gardens were her passion, the place where she could be herself without the weight of ceremony. The smell of earth after rain, of roses in June, of herbs crushed underfoot. The sound of gravel crunching on the paths, of fountains playing, of birds that had made their homes among the exotic trees and shrubs. The feel of sun on her face when she removed her hat in a private corner of the garden. The relief of shade on hot summer afternoons. She kept notebooks where she sketched plants and recorded their properties, where she noted which specimens thrived and which struggled in the English climate. Botany was more than a hobby for Charlotte. It was a science, a way of understanding the world, a connection to the natural order that existed beyond politics and court intrigue. Her children, when they were young, would sometimes join her in the garden. She would show them the new arrivals, teach them the names of flowers, let them help water the tender seedlings in the glass houses. These were among her happiest times, moments when she was not queen but simply mother, not performer but teacher. As her children grew, the dynamics of family life grew more complicated. Her eldest son, George, had always been difficult. Even as a child, he was willful and prone to tantrums. He wanted attention, admiration, indulgence. He chafed under his father's preference for simplicity and discipline. When he was given his own establishment at Carlton House, he transformed it into a palace of excess. The walls were hung with silk, the ceilings painted with elaborate frescoes. He collected art and furniture, porcelain and silver, spending vast sums on objects that caught his fancy. He hosted parties that lasted until dawn, where champagne flowed and guests gambled for stakes that could ruin a family. Charlotte was horrified and hurt by his behavior. She had raised him to value duty and restraint, to understand that privilege came with responsibility. Instead, he seemed to embrace every vice available to a man of wealth and position. He drank too much, ate too much, spent too much. He took mistresses and flaunted them in public. He mocked his father and argued with his mother. The relationship between Charlotte and her eldest son was fraught with pain on both sides. Regency felt she had never loved him enough, had always been more concerned with duty than affection. She felt he had squandered every advantage, rejected every value she had tried to instill. Their letters to each other, in later years, were cold and formal, stripped of the warmth that should exist between mother and son. Her other sons were hardly better. Frederick, the second son, was perhaps the most decent of the lot, but even he had mistresses and illegitimate children. William, who would eventually become King William IV, joined the navy and became known for his coarse manners and inappropriate behavior. He lived openly with an actress, Dorothy Jordan, for 20 years and fathered 10 illegitimate children with her before abandoning her to make a more politically advantageous marriage. Edward, the father of Queen Victoria, was strict and disciplined but prone to violence. He was brutal to his soldiers when he commanded a regiment, so harsh that there were mutinies. Augustus fell in love with Lady Augusta Murray and married her in secret, another illegal marriage that had to be annulled. Adolphus was perhaps the most stable, serving competently in the military and eventually making a respectable marriage. The youngest sons, the ones Charlotte had hoped would learn from their older brother's mistakes, were still children when much of this unfolded. But even they would go on to have their scandals and difficulties, their own struggles with the impossible demands of being royal without real power or purpose. Charlotte's daughters, trapped in what they called the nunnery, grew bitter and resentful. They were intelligent, accomplished women with no outlet for their abilities. They played music beautifully, spoke several languages, could draw and paint with skill. But they were not allowed to marry freely, not permitted to leave court for long, not given any meaningful role to play. Augusta never married. She became her mother's companion in later years, dutiful and increasingly sour. Sophia had an affair with one of her father's equerries and may have had a child by him, though the details were hushed up and remain murky. The infant, if there was one, disappeared into obscurity. Mary eventually married her cousin, the Duke of Gloucester, but she was 40, and he was 42. There would be no children. It was companionship more than romance, a refuge from the loneliness of court life more than a love match. Amelia, the youngest and most beautiful of the daughters, fell in love with an equerry named Charles Fitzroy. He was handsome and charming and entirely unsuitable. Amelia became ill with tuberculosis in her early 20s, and as she lay dying, she begged to be allowed to marry him. Charlotte refused. Amelia died at 27, heartbroken and unmarried. Her last letters full of longing for the life she would never have. Charlotte believed she was protecting her daughters from the suffering of childbirth, from the risk of dying young as so many women did, but in protecting them from one kind of suffering, she condemned them to another. They lived long lives, most of them, but they were lives constrained and diminished, potential unfulfilled, happiness deferred and eventually lost. Did Charlotte regret these decisions in her final years? Did she look at her daughters, middle-aged and unmarried, and wonder if she had been wrong? The historical record does not tell us, but we know that her own marriage, despite being arranged, had brought her love and companionship. We know that her children, despite the pain of bearing them, had been a source of joy. Perhaps she did wonder, perhaps she lay awake at night and thought of Amelia dying with Charles Fitzroy's name on her lips. The rooms at Windsor were quieter as Charlotte aged. The children who had once filled them with noise and laughter were grown and gone, living their own lives in their own establishments. George was at Carlton House, Frederick at his own residence. The daughters in their separate apartments, coming and going according to rigid schedules. Charlotte still held her drawing rooms, still presided over presentations of debutantes, still attended concerts and balls when duty required, but she no longer enjoyed these occasions as she once had. The music that had given her such pleasure now seemed hollow. The gossip that had entertained her now seemed trivial. The elaborate gowns and jewels felt like costumes for a performance she was tired of giving. She spent more time at Frogmore, the house she was renovating. It was smaller than the palaces, more intimate, a place where she could escape the weight of being queen. The gardens there were her design entirely, not an inherited project but her own vision made real. She planted flowers that bloomed in succession, so that from early spring until late autumn there would always be color and scent. Crocuses and snowdrops first, then daffodils and tulips, roses in summer, dahlias and asters in fall. She created winding paths that invited walking, benches placed where one could sit and contemplate the view. There was a pond with water lilies, their flat green pads floating on the surface, their flowers opening white and pink in the morning sun. There were willows that dipped their branches toward the water, creating curtains of green that moved in the slightest breeze. The air there smelled of grass and flowers, of water and earth, clean and growing. Charlotte would sit for hours in the garden at Frogmore, sometimes with a book, sometimes with needlework, sometimes with nothing at all, just sitting and watching the light change. These were her moments of peace, the times when the constant demands of her position fell away and she was simply a woman in a garden. Her friendship with Queen Marie Antoinette had been conducted entirely through letters, but it had been real and sustaining. They shared the particular loneliness of being foreign-born queens, of loving their adopted countries while never quite belonging to them. They understood the weight of public scrutiny, the way every gesture was analyzed, every choice criticized. When the French Revolution began, Charlotte followed the news with growing horror. The mob's attack on Versailles, the royal family's imprisonment, the escalating violence. She wrote letters to anyone she thought might help, trying to organize a rescue, to bring Marie Antoinette and her family to safety in England. She prepared rooms at Windsor, ordered them cleaned and furnished, imagined her friend arriving exhausted but safe. She waited for news of the rescue attempt, for word that her friend was on her way. Instead, she learned of the trial, the conviction, the execution. The image of Marie Antoinette mounting the scaffold haunted Charlotte. She who had been queen, who had danced at Versailles, who had written letters about music and children and the small pleasures of daily life, cut down by the guillotine in front of a crowd that cheered her death. Charlotte went into mourning. She wore black, refused to attend festivities, withdrew from public life as much as she could. The loss of her friend coincided with the worsening of George's illness, and together these events pushed her into a depression from which she never fully recovered. The king, in his madness, did not understand what had happened. He spoke of Marie Antoinette as if she were still alive, asked when she might visit, worried about whether accommodations at Windsor would be suitable. Charlotte could not correct him, could not explain that her friend was dead. She simply nodded and changed the subject, bearing the pain alone. The snuff she took for her headaches became a habit she could not break. It gave temporary relief but left her irritable and unsettled when the effects wore off. Her ladies worried about the amount she consumed, the way her fingers were always reaching for the small enameled snuff box she carried. Her temper, which had been even in her younger years, became unpredictable. She would snap at her ladies over trivial matters, then apologize moments later. She would weep suddenly, without apparent cause, then compose herself and carry on as if nothing had happened. The strain of decades, of constant pregnancy and public performance, of watching her husband descend into madness and her children waste their potential, had worn away her resilience. She still attended to her duties when required. When the Prince of Wales became Prince Regent in 1811, Charlotte resumed her role as First Lady of the Court. She stood beside her son at state functions, received foreign dignitaries, presided over drawing rooms. But it was performance now, nothing more. She moved through the rituals like an actress who has played the same role for so many years that she no longer needs to think about her lines. She smiled when appropriate, nodded graciously, made small talk with practiced ease. Inside, she was hollow, exhausted, longing for release. The Prince Regent's court was very different from the one Charlotte had known in her youth. George surrounded himself with aesthetes and dandies, men who cared more about the cut of their coats than the governance of the nation. He spent obscene amounts of money renovating his palaces while ordinary people starved. The Napoleonic Wars dragged on, consuming resources and lives. British soldiers fought in Spain and Portugal, at sea against French ships, in colonies around the world. The cost was staggering, and Parliament imposed harsh taxes to pay for the war effort. The poor bore the brunt of these taxes while the rich, like the Prince Regent, lived in unimaginable luxury. Charlotte saw the contradiction, felt the wrongness of it, but what could she do? She was an old woman now, a queen consort without real power, watching as her son made the monarchy more unpopular with every extravagant gesture. She continued her charitable work, quietly and without fanfare. She donated money to orphanages and hospitals, to schools for poor children, to funds that supported soldiers' widows. It was a small thing, inadequate in the face of so much suffering, but it was what she could do. Her granddaughter Princess Charlotte was one of the few bright spots in these dark years. The girl was everything her father was not: modest, thoughtful, genuinely concerned about others. When she walked through London, people cheered her. When she visited charitable institutions, she asked intelligent questions and seemed truly moved by what she saw. Charlotte loved the girl fiercely, saw in her the hope for a better future. They would sit together in the Queen's private rooms, talking about books and music, about the world beyond the palace walls. The princess would tell her grandmother about her dreams for when she became queen, about reforms she wanted to make, about the kind of monarch she hoped to be. She wanted to be more accessible to her people, less remote and formal. She wanted to use the crown's influence to improve education, to support the arts, to help those in need. She spoke with passion and conviction, and Charlotte believed her. This granddaughter would be different. This granddaughter would make the monarchy mean something again. When Princess Charlotte announced her engagement to Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, the nation celebrated. Leopold was handsome and intelligent, a military hero with a good reputation. The couple seemed genuinely in love, unlike so many royal marriages. They were young and beautiful and full of promise. Charlotte attended their wedding with joy that was untainted by her usual melancholy. Here, finally, was something good, something pure. A young couple beginning their life together, planning for a family, for the future. The princess would have children, and one of them would inherit the throne. The succession was secure. The nightmare of royal dysfunction might finally end. The princess became pregnant in early 1817. Charlotte watched her granddaughter's belly swell with the same mixture of hope and dread she had felt with her own pregnancies. Childbirth was dangerous, always, no matter how healthy the mother, no matter how skilled the doctors. But the princess was young and strong. Surely she would be fine. November came, and the princess went into labor. It was long and difficult, the baby breech, the pain excruciating. After more than 50 hours of labor, the child was born dead. A stillborn boy who had died in the womb. The princess, exhausted and bleeding, seemed to rally briefly, then suddenly collapsed. The doctors could not save her. She died just after midnight on November 6, 1817, 21 years old. The hope of the nation extinguished in a matter of hours. The country went into mourning, shops closed, church bells tolled. People wept in the streets. It was not just grief for a beloved princess, but despair for the future. With her death, the succession was thrown into chaos. There was no clear heir, no one to take the throne when the Prince Regent eventually died. Charlotte received the news at Windsor. She was 73 years old, worn down by decades of grief and strain. The loss of this granddaughter, this bright light in the gathering dark, was almost more than she could bear. She took to her bed, could not eat, could barely speak. Her daughters gathered around her, trying to offer comfort. But what comfort was there? Another child gone, another life cut short, another hope destroyed. Charlotte had buried 2 young sons decades ago, had watched them die of smallpox, helpless to save them. She had watched her daughter Amelia die of tuberculosis, wasting away slowly while Charlotte stood by. Now her granddaughter, her namesake, her hope for the future. The palace at Windsor was draped in black. The court wore mourning dress. Life went on because it had to, but the joy had gone out of it. What little joy remained. Charlotte moved through her days like a ghost, present but not really there, going through the motions because duty demanded it. The succession crisis forced Charlotte's sons to scramble for wives. It was undignified, this sudden rush to marry and produce heirs, but it was necessary. Several of them, middle-aged men who had lived for decades with their mistresses, now abandoned those women and sought out young royal brides. And Edward, Duke of Kent, married a German widow, Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. She was 31, already had 2 children from her first marriage, and was clearly capable of bearing more. They married quickly, efficiently, a transaction designed to produce an heir. Victoria became pregnant almost immediately. The child would be born in May 1819, just in time to qualify for the succession under the rules Parliament had established. Edward made sure his wife was in England for the birth, not in Germany, so there could be no question about the child's status. Charlotte knew all of this was happening around her, but she was too tired to care much. Another grandchild coming, another baby who might or might not survive to adulthood. Another roll of the dice in the endless game of succession. She was 74 years old, and she was done. Her health had been declining for months. She had pain in her abdomen, difficulty eating, waves of nausea that left her weak and shaking. The doctors did what they could, which was very little. They prescribed rest and bland food, cold compresses and herbal tinctures that did nothing to ease her suffering. She spent her final months mostly at Windsor, in rooms that had been her home for nearly 60 years. The walls were familiar. The views from the windows known down to the smallest detail. She could see the gardens from her window, the ones she had helped design, the trees she had planted decades ago now fully grown. In the evenings, light would slant through the tall windows, golden and soft, painting the room in warm tones. The air smelled of lavender, of beeswax, of the peculiar scent of old fabric and old furniture, of time layered upon time. The sounds were muted here, distant voices in corridors, the rustle of her lady's skirts, the tick of the clock on the mantel. She thought about her life in these final days. Thought about the girl she had been at Mirow, running through gardens, learning her letters, never imagining the life that awaited her. Thought about the sea voyage that had made her so sick, the terror and strangeness of arriving in a foreign country to marry a man she had never met. Thought about George, about falling in love with him despite everything, about the years when they had been happy together, the births of their children, the nights when he would come to her room and they would talk until dawn, the walks in the garden with his hand in hers, the music they had listened to together, the quiet evenings reading by the fire, the small domestic pleasures that had sustained them. Thought about the descent into madness, the horror of watching him slip away, the way he had looked at her near the end, sometimes recognizing her, sometimes not, the conversations he had with their dead sons, calling to Octavius and Alfred as if they stood beside him, the grief of losing him slowly, piece by piece, while he still lived and breathed. Thought about her children, all 15 of them, the ones who had died young, forever children in her memory, the ones who had grown into troubled adults, disappointing her in ways both large and small, the daughters she had tried to protect but had only imprisoned, the sons who had squandered every advantage. Did she regret her choices? Did she wish she had done things differently? The historical record does not tell us what Charlotte thought in those final days. We know she was in pain, that she was weak, that she knew death was coming. We know her son, the Prince Regent, visited her and sat by her bedside. We know her daughters were there, Augusta and Elizabeth and Mary, the unmarried ones who had stayed closest to her. On November 7, 1818, as autumn darkened toward winter, Charlotte's breathing became labored. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes aware of the people around her, sometimes lost in memories or dreams. The Prince Regent took her hand, held it as the hours passed. She died just after noon, 74 years old, Queen of Great Britain and Ireland for 57 years. Her son was holding her hand when she passed. This son she had such a complicated relationship with, who had caused her so much pain and disappointment, but who was still her child, still the baby she had held 56 years before. The news spread through the palace, through the town, through the country. Queen Charlotte was dead. The woman who had introduced the Christmas tree, who had presented debutantes, who had planted gardens and patronized musicians. The woman who had borne 15 children and buried 3. The woman who had loved a king and watched him go mad. She was gone. The Strelitzia Regina bloomed in the glass houses, its extraordinary orange and blue flowers a living memorial. The trees she had planted decades ago stood tall, their branches spreading wide, sheltering the paths where she had walked. At Frogmore, her final project, the rooms she had designed stood empty, waiting. The gardens there would bloom in spring as they always had, crocuses and daffodils, roses in summer, the cycle continuing regardless of who was there to see it. King George III, locked in his madness at Windsor, was not told of his wife's death. His attendants judged that he would not understand, that the news would only distress him without meaning. He lived in a fog now, sometimes playing his harpsichord, sometimes walking in the gardens, sometimes sitting in silence for hours. Did some part of him know, despite the madness? Did he feel her absence, the way one feels a change in the weather before the rain begins? We cannot know. He lived another 14 months, dying on January 29, 1820, at the age of 81. They buried him beside Charlotte in the royal vault under St. George's Chapel at Windsor. Together again in death as they had been in life, the king and queen who had loved each other through everything, who had tried to be good rulers and good parents and good people, who had succeeded and failed in equal measure. 6 months after Charlotte's death, her granddaughter was born, Victoria of Kent, daughter of Edward and his German bride, born in Kensington Palace on May 24, 1819. The child who would become Queen Victoria, who would reign for 63 years, who would give her name to an age. Charlotte never met this granddaughter, never held her or blessed her or told her stories. But Victoria grew up hearing about her grandmother, about Queen Charlotte, who had come from Germany as a young bride, who had made England her home. When Victoria married her own German prince, Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, she carried on Charlotte's tradition of bringing German culture to the British court. The Christmas tree tradition that Charlotte had introduced flourished under Victoria. Photographs of the royal family gathered around their Christmas tree helped popularize the custom throughout Britain and its empire, until it became so thoroughly English that people forgot it had German origins. The debutante presentations that Charlotte had begun continued until the mid-20th century, shaping London society for generations. Young women still curtsied in their white gowns and ostrich feathers, still hoped to catch the eye of eligible bachelors, still launched their adult lives with a presentation at court. The tradition evolved but retained its essential character, a ritual of transition that Charlotte had created on her 38th birthday. The charitable work that Charlotte had made central to the royal family's identity became even more prominent under Victoria and her descendants. The idea that royalty had a duty to help those in need, to use their privilege for good, to be seen supporting hospitals and schools and orphanages, this was Charlotte's legacy as much as any law or policy. At Windsor, life continued without her. The rooms were redecorated, the furniture rearranged, new monarchs put their own stamp on the castle. But the bones of the place remained the same, the stone walls and tall windows, the chapel where Charlotte and George lay side by side in their vault. The gardens at Kew expanded and evolved, becoming one of the world's great botanical institutions. The Royal Botanic Gardens still house thousands of plant species from every corner of the globe, still conduct scientific research, still welcome visitors who walk the paths and marvel at the diversity of plant life. Charlotte's passion for botany, her early efforts to collect exotic specimens, was the seed from which this great garden grew. Buckingham Palace, the Queen's house that George bought for Charlotte, was transformed by later monarchs but remained the official London residence of the royal family. Every state occasion, every balcony appearance, every royal wedding and jubilee takes place at the palace that was once Charlotte's private retreat. The music she loved, the composers she patronized, are still performed. Handel's works are still beloved. Johann Christian Bach's compositions still played by musicians who may not know that he was Queen Charlotte's music teacher. Mozart's Opus 3, dedicated to her, still appears on concert programs and recordings. The Christmas tree at Windsor Castle still stands each year, decorated and lit, a tradition unbroken since Charlotte introduced it. The sovereign still attends the annual presentation, though now it is called the state opening of Parliament rather than a debutante ball. The basic rhythm of the court calendar, the London season, the movement between palaces, much of this structure was established or reinforced during Charlotte's long tenure as queen. Her image appears in portraits hanging in palaces and museums, in engravings and prints in the statues that stand in Charlotte, North Carolina. Alan Ramsay's portraits show her in her youth, her face round and pleasant, her eyes intelligent, her expression serene. Later portraits show the toll that time and sorrow took, the lines deepening around her mouth, the weariness in her eyes. Looking at these portraits now, knowing her story, one can see both the girl from Mecklenburg and the woman she became, the princess who knew nothing of politics, and the queen who navigated court intrigue for nearly 6 decades. The young bride meeting her husband at a garden gate, and the old woman watching him descend into madness, the mother of 15 children and the grandmother who outlived some of them. What would Charlotte think if she could see how she is remembered now? The speculation about her ancestry, the renewed interest in her story, the way her name appears in contemporary discussions about race and royal history. Would she be pleased or puzzled? Proud or dismissive? We can imagine her in her garden at Frogmore, an old woman sitting on a bench in the shade, watching light move across the water of her pond. The air is warm, the scent of roses heavy on the breeze. A bee moves from flower to flower, its hum a small music. In the distance, church bells mark the hour. She is tired, her bones aching, her head pounding despite the snuff she has taken. But there is also peace here in this moment, in this place she has created. The garden will go on without her. The roses will bloom next summer whether she is there to see them or not. The willow will dip its branches toward the water. The birds will nest in the trees. The seasons will turn. She has done what she could. Borne her children, loved her husband, performed her duties, planted her gardens. She has made mistakes and tried to correct them, caused pain and tried to ease it, lived as best she could within the constraints of her position and her time. The sun moves lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the lawn. The air begins to cool, carrying the first hint of evening. Soon her ladies will come to call her in for dinner, to help her dress for whatever evening engagement awaits. But for now she sits in her garden, in the peace of green growing things, in the company of flowers and trees and the soft sound of water. This is what remains: gardens and traditions, music and flowers, the story of a life lived in service and sorrow, in duty and love. A girl who crossed the sea and never went home. A queen who shaped a nation and a dynasty. A woman who planted gardens that bloom still, who introduced customs that endure, who left marks on the world that time has not erased. The vault beneath St. George's Chapel is silent and dark, the stone cold, the air still. Charlotte rests there beside George, as she wished to be, together in death as in life. Above them, the chapel soars upward, stone and glass, light and shadow. The windows cast colored light onto the floor, patterns that shift as the sun moves across the sky. Visitors walk through the chapel, looking at the monuments, reading the inscriptions, trying to imagine the lives of those who rest below. Some pause at the marker for George III and Queen Charlotte, considering their story, the long marriage and the madness, the 15 children and the American Revolution, the garden and the music and the Christmas tree. But most of what Charlotte was, most of who she was, cannot be captured in stone or inscription. It lives instead in the traditions she began, in the gardens she planted, in the descendants she never met who carry forward aspects of her legacy, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. When you see a Christmas tree lit with candles or electric lights, wound with tinsel and crowned with a star, think of Charlotte showing that first decorated tree to the children of Windsor in 1800. When you walk through Kew Gardens among plants from every continent, think of Charlotte working with her gardeners to expand the collection, learning the names of exotic species, sketching flowers in her notebooks. When you read about the social season in a novel by Jane Austen or Georgette Heyer, about débutantes and balls and the marriage market, think of Charlotte beginning that tradition, presenting young women to society, playing matchmaker, reading the gossip columns with delight. When you consider the modern royal family's charitable work, their patronage of hospitals and schools, their visits to disadvantaged communities, think of Charlotte deciding to make philanthropy central to the monarchy's public images, throwing charity balls, founding institutions to help those in need. These are not small things. They are the ways culture evolves, the ways tradition is born and carried forward, the ways one person's choices can ripple out across generations, shaping the lives of people they will never meet in places they will never see. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who crossed the North Sea in 1761, seasick and frightened, who met her husband for the first time at a garden gate, who bore 15 children and buried 3, who introduced the Christmas tree and presented the debutantes, who loved music and gardens, who watched her husband go mad and her children waste their potential, who died in 1818 at Windsor, her son holding her hand. This is her story, as complete as we can tell it across more than 2 centuries. The facts of her life, the dates and names and events, and the spaces between those facts where we can only imagine. The texture of her days, the scent of her gardens, the sound of her voice speaking German accented English, the feel of her hand in her husband's as they walked together through grounds that would outlive them both. The world she knew is gone now, swept away by revolutions and wars, by technological change and social transformation. The British Empire she was queen of has dissolved into commonwealth and memory. The values she was raised with, duty, obedience, traditional hierarchy, have been challenged and changed, but the gardens still bloom. The traditions still continue. The story still resonates. This tale of a foreign bride who became English, of a woman who endured and persevered, who loved and lost, who planted things that would grow long after she was gone. In the end, perhaps that is enough. Not to be perfect, not to succeed at everything, but to leave something behind that has value, that brings beauty or joy or meaning to others. Charlotte's Christmas tree, bright with candles in a drawing room at Windsor, children gathering around it in wonder. Charlotte's garden at Kew, the Strelitzia Regina blooming in impossible colors. Charlotte's debutantes curtsying in their white gowns, beginning their adult lives. Charlotte's charity hospitals and orphanages, offering help to those who needed it most. These are her monuments, more lasting than bronze or marble. They are woven into the fabric of British culture so thoroughly that many people do not know their origin, do not remember that a German queen brought these gifts across the water and made them English. The light fades now, evening settling over Windsor. The stone walls hold the day's warmth for a little while longer. In the chapel, shadows gather in the corners and the stained glass windows dim as the sun sets. Below, in the vault, Charlotte rests in the darkness beyond the reach of pain or sorrow, beyond the demands of duty, beyond the complications of love and family and power. The seasons turn and turn again. Spring comes to England with crocuses and daffodils, summer with roses, autumn with the leaves turning gold and red, winter with frost and the promise of Christmas. The pattern repeats, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. And in that turning, in that endless cycle of growth and dormancy, bloom and fade, there is comfort. Charlotte, who loved gardens, who understood the rhythms of the natural world, who found peace among growing things, she would have appreciated this. The knowledge that life goes on, that gardens bloom and fade and bloom again, that beauty returns even after the darkest winter. So her tale reaches its end, or rather reaches the place where we must let it rest. There is more that could be told, more details to explore, more speculation and an analysis. But the essential story is complete. The arc of a life, from birth to death, from Mecklenburg to Windsor, from obscurity to queenship, and back to the silence of the grave. What remains is memory, is story, is the accumulated weight of a life lived in public and in private, with courage and fear, with joy and sorrow, with hope that was sometimes fulfilled and sometimes crushed. What remains is the Christmas tree and the garden, the debutante and the charity ball, the music and the tradition. What remains is this. Once there was a girl named Charlotte who became a queen, who crossed an ocean and made a foreign country home, who planted gardens that bloom still, who began traditions that endure, who loved a king and stood beside him through madness and revolution, who bore 15 children and tried to raise them well, who did her duty as she understood it for nearly 60 years. And when she died on a November day in 1818, the world continued turning. The sun rose and set. The seasons changed, life went on. But something had shifted, some small thread in the great tapestry had been cut, and the pattern that emerged would be forever different because she had been part of it. Rest now, Charlotte, in your vault beneath the chapel. The gardens you planted still bloom. The traditions you began still continue. Your story still speaks across the centuries to those who pause to listen. Your life, with all its contradictions and complications, its triumphs and its tragedies, is part of the great human story, the tale of how we live and love and lose and somehow keep going. The chapel bells ring the hour, their sound carrying across the grounds of Windsor, across the town, fading into the distance, the sound of time passing, of moments adding up to hours, hours to days, days to years, years to lifetimes. The sound of history being made, one heartbeat at a time, one breath, one choice, one planted seed that grows into a tree that outlives its gardener. The story of Queen Charlotte comes to rest here, in the quiet of evening, in the peace of completed things, in the soft darkness where all stories eventually go. The tale is told, the life is lived, the garden blooms and fades and blooms again. And somewhere in all that turning, in all that endless cycle of life and death and life again, there is grace, there is meaning, there is the simple truth that we were here, that we mattered, that we left something behind. Good night, Charlotte. Rest well in your vault beneath the chapel, beside the king you loved, in the country you made your own. Your work is done. Your story is told. Your gardens bloom eternal in the minds of those who remember, in the traditions that continue, in the small acts of beauty and kindness that ripple forward through time, touching lives you never knew, in places you never imagined, in ways you could never have foreseen. The tale of Queen Charlotte is complete. The winter of 1793, when Marie Antoinette died, marked a turning point in Charlotte's life. She was 49 years old, past the age of childbearing, no longer a young queen but a matriarch. The woman who had once delighted in gossip and music found herself drawing inward, away from the glitter of court life, toward the quieter spaces where she could think and grieve without an audience watching her every expression. She began to spend more time in her private apartments, rooms where only her most trusted ladies were admitted. The walls were hung with silk in colors she had chosen years before, soft blues and greens that reminded her of gardens. There were portraits of her children as young people, before disappointment had marked their faces. When they still seemed full of promise, she would sit by the window in the mornings, watching light move across the castle grounds. The view changed with the seasons, but the rhythm remained constant. Gardeners working among the flower beds, their movements slow and deliberate. Groundskeepers raking gravel paths, the sound a soft scraping that carried up to her window. Birds landing and taking flight, their shadows crossing the lawn. Her ladies learned to read her moods, to know when she wanted conversation, and when she preferred silence. There was Mrs. Schwellenberg, who had come with Charlotte from Germany all those years ago, and remained fiercely loyal despite her difficult personality. There were the English ladies she had gradually befriended, women who understood the peculiar isolation of court life, who could sit companionably with needlework without feeling the need to fill every moment with chatter. Charlotte's daily routine had a comforting predictability. She rose early, even as she aged, unable to break the habit of decades. Her ladies would help her dress, the process taking longer now that her hands sometimes trembled and her joints ached. The gowns she wore in private were simpler than her court dress, made of good fabric but without excessive ornamentation. She would breakfast lightly, tea and toast, perhaps a soft-boiled egg. Her appetite had diminished over the years, and rich food no longer agreed with her. She remembered the elaborate meals of her youth, the feasts that stretched for hours, course after course. Now she preferred simplicity, food that was easy to digest and did not sit heavily in her stomach. After breakfast, she would attend to correspondence if she felt well enough. Letters to her brother in Mecklenburg, updates on family matters, requests for news from home, letters to her children, though these were often difficult to write. What did one say to sons who had disappointed you, to daughters whose unhappiness you had inadvertently caused? She tried to strike a balance between affection and dignity, between honesty and discretion. There were letters from strangers as well, people asking for royal patronage, for money, for intervention in some dispute or another. Charlotte tried to respond to as many as she could, especially those that seemed genuinely desperate. She would instruct her secretary to send a small sum to a widow who had lost her husband, to help fund a school for poor children, to support a musician fallen on hard times. The snuff box was always within reach. She would open it throughout the day, taking pinches of the powdered tobacco, feeling the brief clarity it brought before the familiar headache returned. Her ladies worried but said nothing. What could they say? She was queen. Her habits were her own. When the weather permitted, Charlotte still walked in the gardens, though she moved more slowly now, sometimes requiring a cane. She would pause often to catch her breath, to rest on benches that had been placed at intervals along the paths. The gardens at Windsor were mature now, the trees she had planted decades ago providing shade, their branches spreading wide. She noticed things she had been too busy to see in her younger years. The way lichen grew on the north side of stone statues. The patterns frost made on windows in winter, delicate as lace. The particular shade of green that new leaves showed in spring, so bright it almost hurt to look at. The way evening light turned everything golden, softening edges, making even the ordinary beautiful. Her granddaughter, Princess Charlotte, would sometimes join her on these walks. The girl was lively and curious, full of questions about everything. She wanted to know about her grandmother's childhood in Germany, about the journey across the sea, about what it had been like to meet her grandfather for the first time. Charlotte answered as honestly as she could without being inappropriate. She spoke of feeling frightened and hopeful at once, of not knowing what awaited her, of discovering that the stranger she had married was someone she could love. The princess listened with rapt attention, her young face serious. They would walk slowly along the gravel paths, the princess adjusting her pace to match her grandmother's. Charlotte pointed out plants she had introduced to the garden, told stories about where they had come from, who had brought them back from distant voyages. The girl seemed genuinely interested, asking intelligent questions, showing the same love of growing things that Charlotte herself felt. These were precious times, these walks with her granddaughter. Charlotte saw in the girl a chance at redemption, at a future where the monarchy might mean something good again. The princess spoke of wanting to help people, of using her position to make life better for those who suffered. She was idealistic in the way only the young can be, Believing that good intentions and hard work could change the world, Charlotte did not discourage her. Let the girl have her dreams. There would be time enough for disappointment, for learning that power was more complicated than it seemed, that good intentions often produced unintended consequences. For now, let her believe that she could make a difference, that her life would matter in ways that transcended mere ceremony and display. The Regency period brought new strains. Charlotte's son, now Prince Regent, held the power his father could no longer exercise, but he wielded it poorly, more interested in aesthetics than governance, in pleasure than duty. His spending was obscene, his behavior often embarrassing. The public, already suffering from war and economic hardship, grew increasingly resentful. Charlotte found herself in the awkward position of having to represent the crown at public events while privately disapproving of how her son conducted himself. She stood beside him at state occasions, smiled for the crowds, played her role with the skill of long practice, but in private, the tension between them was palpable. They argued about his treatment of his wife, Princess Caroline. Charlotte had no great love for her daughter-in-law, who could be crude and inappropriate, but the way her son publicly humiliated Caroline was cruel beyond measure. He kept her from seeing their daughter except at rigidly controlled intervals. He spread rumors about her behavior, some true, some exaggerated, some entirely fabricated. Charlotte tried to mediate, to convince her son to behave with more dignity, but he would not listen. He was king in all but name now, and he knew it. What could his aging mother do to control him? She had no real power, only influence, and even that was waning as he surrounded himself with advisors who encouraged his worst impulses. The war with France dragged on year after year. Charlotte heard reports of battles won and lost, of British soldiers dying in Spain and Portugal, at sea and in distant colonies. She read lists of casualties in the newspapers, saw the names of families she knew, young men who had been presented at court, and were now buried in foreign soil. She increased her charitable work, focusing especially on widows and orphans of soldiers. It seemed the least she could do to help those who had lost everything in service to the crown. She organized fundraising events, used her influence to pressure wealthy families to contribute, personally donated substantial sums from her own income. The work gave her purpose during years that might otherwise have felt empty. Her children were grown and gone, her husband lost to madness, her public role reduced to ceremonial appearances. But in the letters of thanks from women whose children now had food and shelter, in the reports from schools she had helped establish, she found validation that her life had meant something beyond mere display. Her relationship with her daughters became more complicated as they aged. Augusta, the eldest daughter still at home, had become bitter and sharp-tongued. She was past 40 now, with no prospect of marriage, trapped in a life she had not chosen. She took her frustration out on the younger sisters, on the servants, sometimes even on Charlotte herself. There were days when Augusta would barely speak, moving through the palace like a ghost, her face set in lines of permanent disappointment. Other days she would erupt in anger over trivial matters, shouting at servants, slamming doors, behaving in ways that would have been unthinkable when she was younger. Charlotte understood the source of her daughter's unhappiness, but did not know how to ease it. An apology seemed inadequate, an admission that she had made mistakes in keeping her daughters so close, in denying them the chance to marry and have families of their own. But what good would an apology do now? The years could not be reclaimed, the chances could not be given back. Sophia was gentler, but equally unhappy. She had her secret, the affair with the equerry, possibly a child given away to be raised by others. Charlotte suspected but had never confronted her daughter directly. What would be the point? The damage was done, the secret buried. Better to maintain the fiction of ignorance than to force a confession that would help no one. Mary seemed the most resigned to her fate. She occupied herself with music and drawings, spent hours practicing the piano, producing watercolor landscapes that showed real skill. She did not complain, did not rage against her circumstances. She simply endured day after day, year after year, waiting for something that never came. When Mary finally did marry the Duke of Gloucester, she was 40 years old. The wedding was a quiet affair, nothing like the grand ceremonies Charlotte had imagined for her daughters when they were young. Mary left the palace with what seemed like relief, glad to finally have a household of her own, a husband who was kind if not exciting, a life that was hers to shape however she wished within the constraints of her rank and age. Charlotte watched her daughter leave and felt the weight of what might have been. If she had allowed them to marry younger, they might have had children, might have known the particular joy and pain of motherhood. They might have had full lives instead of these truncated, constrained existences. But she had been trying to protect them, trying to spare them the suffering she had endured. 15 pregnancies, the pain of childbirth over and over, the fear each time that this might be the one that killed her, the grief of burying children, of watching them die and being unable to save them. She had wanted to spare her daughters all of that. Instead, she had condemned them to a different kind of suffering, the slow erosion of hope, the gradual understanding that their lives would never include the things most women took for granted. Husbands, children, homes of their own. They would always be the king's daughters, the queen's daughters, royal and important and utterly powerless to determine their own fates. Amelia's death in 1810 was especially hard. She was the youngest, the baby, just 27 years old. Tuberculosis had consumed her slowly over several years, wasting her body until she was almost unrecognizable. Charlotte had sat by her bedside through the final weeks, watching her daughter struggle for each breath. Listening to her beg for permission to marry her beloved Charles, Charlotte had refused. Even at the end, even when it was clear that Amelia was dying, she would not permit the marriage. It would have been irregular, inappropriate, setting a precedent she could not allow. Better for Amelia to die unmarried than to marry beneath her station. Or so Charlotte reasoned. Did she regret that decision in the years that followed? The historical record does not say, but how could she not? She had watched her youngest daughter die with her beloved's name on her lips, denied the one thing that might have brought her comfort in her final hours. That kind of regret does not disappear simply because it is never spoken aloud. King George, in his madness, did not understand that Amelia had died. He spoke of her as if she were still alive, asked when she would visit, worried about her health. No one corrected him. What would be the point? He lived in a world of his own now, a place where some of his children were still young, where Octavius and Alfred still played in the gardens, where his wife was still the young woman he had married 50 years before. Charlotte visited him less and less frequently as the years passed. It was too painful to see him like this, too difficult to smile and nod while he spoke nonsense, while he failed to recognize her or mistook her for someone else. Better to remember him as he had been, the young king who had spoken German with her, who had loved music and farming, who had been faithful to her when faithfulness was not the norm for kings. The palace physicians kept him clean and comfortable, ensured he ate and slept, prevented him from harming himself during his more agitated episodes. He would play his harpsichord sometimes, the music still beautiful even though his mind was gone. He would walk in the gardens escorted by attendants, moving among the plants and trees with a kind of vague contentment. When Charlotte tried to find peace in knowing he was cared for, that he did not suffer physical pain, that he had moments of what seemed like happiness, but it was poor comfort. The man she loved was gone, replaced by this shell who wore his face but did not know her, who lived in a past that existed only in his damaged mind. The war finally ended in 1815 with Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. Britain had been at war for more than 20 years, an entire generation raised knowing nothing but conflict. The peace came with exhaustion and relief in equal measure. The country was victorious but devastated, the treasury depleted, the economy in shambles. Charlotte was 71 years old when peace came. She had been queen for 54 years, had seen the loss of the American colonies, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars. She had watched the world transform around her. Empires rise and fall, borders redrawn. The order she had known as a young woman completely overturned. She felt old, worn down, ready for rest. But there was no rest for a queen, not really. There were still appearances to make, ceremonies to attend, duties to perform. She continued because that was what she had always done, what she had been taught to do. You endure, you persist. You do your duty regardless of how you feel. Her health declined noticeably after Amelia's death. The pain in her abdomen grew worse, waves of nausea that left her weak and shaking. She ate less and less, her already thin frame becoming almost skeletal. Her skin took on a yellowish tinge, her eyes sunken, her hands trembling. The physicians did what little they could. They had no real understanding of what was wrong, no effective treatments to offer. They bled her, thinking to balance her humors. They prescribed rest and bland food. herbs and tinctures that did nothing to ease her suffering. They watched and waited and hoped, but they could not heal her. Charlotte knew she was dying. She had seen enough death to recognize its approach. The gradual weakening, the loss of appetite, the way the world seemed to be receding, becoming less real, less immediate. She began to put her affairs in order, writing instructions for her funeral, deciding which of her possessions should go to which of her children. She sorted through her papers, burning some, setting others aside to be kept. Letters from George in their early years together, love notes, and domestic communications that were too private to preserve, letters from Marie Antoinette, the last ones desperate and frightened, begging for help that never came. Letters from her brother, from her mother, from friends long dead. It was strange to see her life reduced to stacks of paper, boxes of letters and documents. Had it all been real? The girl at Mirow, the sea voyage, the wedding to a king she had never met, the children born and raised and lost, the gardens planted, the music heard, the long slow descent into grief and regret. Sometimes it felt like a story that had happened to someone else, a tale she had read rather than lived. She gave away jewelry to her daughters, specific pieces to each one with notes explaining their history and significance. A necklace that had belonged to her mother, earrings George had given her on their 10th anniversary, a brooch set with stones from Mecklenburg. Small things that carried memory, that would outlast her and connect her daughters to the past after she was gone. She met with her confessor, a German-speaking clergyman, who had served her for many years. They talked about her life, about her regrets and her joys, about what she believed awaited her after death. She was not afraid of dying, she told him. She was tired, ready for it to be over, ready to rest. What did frighten her was the thought of being forgotten, of her life fading away as if it had never been. But the clergyman reassured her that she would be remembered, that her contributions would endure, that the gardens she had planted and the traditions she had begun would keep her memory alive long after she was gone. Princess Charlotte's engagement to Prince Leopold in 1816 brought a brief flicker of joy. Here was hope for the future, a new generation, a chance for things to be different and better. The princess was so happy, so full of plans, so confident that her life would be long and useful and good. Queen Charlotte attended the wedding, though it took all her strength to sit through the ceremony. She wore her finest gown, had her ladies arrange her hair with care, put on the jewels that marked her rank. She wanted to look like a queen for this, wanted to honor her granddaughter's happiness with her best appearance. She watched the young couple exchange vows and thought of her own wedding 56 years before. How young she had been, how frightened and hopeful at once. How little she had known of what lay ahead. Would Princess Charlotte's marriage be as happy as hers had been? Would the girl find love with this stranger as Charlotte had found love with George? The wedding breakfast was a blur of faces and noise, too much for Charlotte's failing strength. She left early, returning to her apartments at Windsor, grateful to be alone with her ladies, to remove the heavy gown and jewels, to lie down and close her eyes. The news of Princess Charlotte's pregnancy in 1817 brought another surge of hope. An heir, finally, after all the uncertainty and chaos. The succession would be secure, the future settled. Charlotte allowed herself to imagine holding a great-grandchild, to picture the baby that would carry forward the line that would one day sit on the throne she had shared with George, but the hope was short-lived. The news of the birth went wrong, that the baby was dead, that the princess was dying, that everything had gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. Charlotte was at Windsor when word came, in her private apartment surrounded by her ladies. She did not weep. The tears would not come. She sat in her chair by the window staring out at the gardens, trying to understand how this had happened, how hope could be so thoroughly destroyed in a matter of hours. Her granddaughter, her bright, beautiful girl, gone. The baby, the heir, dead before he drew breath. The future, suddenly uncertain again. The succession thrown into chaos. Her ladies tried to offer comfort, but there was no comfort to be had. This was grief beyond words, beyond consolation. Charlotte had buried 2 young sons, had watched Amelia die slowly, had lost Marie Antoinette to the guillotine, had seen George descend into madness. But this felt different, worse somehow. Princess Charlotte had been hope itself, the promise that something good might yet emerge from all the pain and disappointment. The country went into mourning, black crape hung from windows, church bells tolling, strangers weeping in the streets. The grief was real and widespread, not the manufactured sorrow of official mourning but genuine anguish. People had loved Princess Charlotte, had seen in her a better future, had believed that when she became queen things would improve. Charlotte withdrew even further from public life after that. She could not bear to see people, to accept their condolences, to talk about her loss. She stayed in her apartments at Windsor, seeing only her closest ladies, her remaining daughters, occasionally the Prince Regent when duty absolutely required it. The pain in her abdomen grew worse. Food became impossible to tolerate, even the blandest broth making her ill. She grew thinner, her clothes hanging loose on her frame, her face gaunt, her eyes enormous in her wasted face. The physicians increased their visits but could offer nothing of substance, just the same ineffective remedies, the same reassurances that meant nothing. She began to have difficulty sleeping, lying awake through long nights, listening to the sounds of the palace settling, the distant chime of clocks marking the slow passage of hours. She would think about her life, about the choices she had made, about what she might have done differently if she had known then what she knew now. Would she have been kinder to her daughters, allowed them to marry younger? Would she have intervened more in her sons' lives, tried harder to instill discipline and purpose? Would she have been a different kind of queen, more involved in politics, more willing to use her influence? But these thoughts led nowhere useful. The past could not be changed, decisions could not be unmade, the dead could not be brought back. She had done what she thought was right at the time, had tried to balance duty and love, public obligation and private feeling. That she had failed in some ways did not mean she had not tried. Her brother Adolphus Frederick wrote from Mecklenburg, concerned letters asking about her health, offering to visit if she wished. But Charlotte wrote back telling him not to come, that the journey would be long and difficult, that there was nothing he could do, that she was content where she was. She lied about being content. But what good would it do for him to see her like this, wasted and dying, so far from the sister he remembered? Better he keep his memories of her as she had been, young and hopeful, setting off across the sea to become a queen. Better he not see what the years had done to her, how they had worn her down to this fragile shell. Spring came to Windsor in 1818, her last spring though she did not know it yet. The gardens bloomed as they always did, crocuses and daffodils, the trees leafing out in that impossibly bright green of new growth. From her window she could see the gardens spreading across the grounds, color and life returning after the grey of winter. She wished she had strength enough to walk among the flowers one more time, to smell the earth warming in the sun, to feel grass beneath her feet. But she was too weak now to manage the stairs, too fragile to risk the journey from her apartments to the gardens. She had to content herself with watching from her window, with sending her ladies to bring back cuttings of flowers to place in vases by her bed. The scent of roses filled her room in June, heavy and sweet, almost overwhelming in the confined space. Her ladies changed the water daily, kept the blooms fresh, brought new cuttings as the old ones faded. Charlotte would lie in her bed and breathe in the perfume, remembering summers at Kew, afternoons spent among the roses learning their names and habits. She was bedridden now, too weak to sit up for more than a few minutes at a time. Her daughters took turns sitting with her, reading aloud, doing needlework, simply being present. The Prince Regent visited, sitting awkwardly by her bed, trying to make conversation, both of them aware of all the unsaid things between them, all the disappointments and resentments that had accumulated over the years. She tried to forgive him, tried to see past his faults to the little boy he had been, the child who had once delighted her, but forgiveness was harder than she expected. The hurt went too deep, the disappointment too profound. Still she did her best to be kind, to speak gently, to let him know she loved him even if she could not approve of how he lived. Summer faded into autumn, the leaves turning color outside her window, gold and red and brown. The air grew cooler, crisp with the promise of winter. Charlotte felt herself fading along with the season, her hold on life loosening. She slept more and more, drifting in and out of consciousness, sometimes unsure if she was awake or dreaming. She saw George as he had been when they first married, young and shy, speaking German with her in their private apartments. She saw her children as babies, perfect and new, before disappointment had marked them. She saw the gardens at Mirow, the lake reflecting the sky, swans gliding across dark water. Were these memories or dreams or something in between? To her, it hardly mattered anymore. Past and present blurred together, The girl she had been, and the woman she had become existing simultaneously in her mind. She was 17 and crossing the North Sea. She was 74 and dying at Windsor. She was both and neither. Time collapsing into a single eternal moment. November came, cold and grey. The trees were bare now, the garden sleeping, waiting for spring. Charlotte knew she would not see another spring, would not watch the crocuses push through the soil, would not smell the roses bloom in June. This was the end, finally, the long campaign over, the burden about to be lifted. Her breathing became labored, each breath requiring effort and will. Her daughters gathered around her bed, Augusta and Elizabeth and Mary, the three who were closest, who had stayed with her through everything. The Prince Regent came and took her hand, held it as the hours passed, as daylight faded and candles were lit, as the palace grew quiet around them. She was ready. She had lived 74 years, had been queen for 57 of them, had borne 15 children and buried 3, had planted gardens and begun traditions, had loved a king and watched him go mad, had done her duty as she understood it through revolution and war, through grief and disappointment, through all the complicated, messy reality of a life lived in public view. The pain was less now, fading along with everything else. The room grew dimmer even though the candles burned bright. The voices of her children became distant, muffled, as if she were hearing them from far away. Her son's hand holding hers was the only solid thing left, the only anchor to the world she was leaving. And then, as afternoon light faded into evening on November 7, 1818, Charlotte let go. But the breath that had been so difficult to draw simply did not come again. The hand in her son's went limp. The woman who had been Queen Charlotte, who had crossed the sea from Mecklenburg to become Queen of Britain, who had shaped a nation and a dynasty, who had loved and lost and endured. The Prince Regent sat holding his mother's hand for a long time after she died. Not speaking, not moving, simply sitting with her as the evening darkened around them. His sisters wept quietly. The ladies withdrew to give the family privacy in their grief. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare trees, cold and steady, indifferent to the death of queens. Word spread through the palace, through the town, through the country. Queen Charlotte is dead. The woman who had been a constant presence for nearly 6 decades, who had outlasted most of her contemporaries, who had seemed almost eternal in her endurance, was finally gone. Preparations for the funeral began immediately. The elaborate rituals of royal mourning set in motion, black cloth draped over mirrors and windows, servants wearing black armbands, official notices sent to every corner of the realm. Queen Charlotte had died at Windsor after a long illness. The nation mourned, but in the king's apartments no one told George that his wife had died. The physicians judged that he would not understand, that the news would only distress him without meaning. He continued his daily routine, playing his harpsichord, walking in the gardens when weather permitted, speaking to people who existed only in his mind. Did some part of him sense her absence? Did he wake in the night with a feeling that something had changed, that someone was missing? There is no way to know. The madness had taken him so completely that he lived in a world of his own making, where Charlotte was still young, where his children were still small. Charlotte's funeral took place at Windsor on a cold December night. The chapel was lit with hundreds of candles, their flames flickering in the draughts that moved through the ancient building. The coffin was carried by pallbearers in full ceremonial dress, the weight of it heavy with lead and oak and the body of the woman who had been queen. The Prince Regent attended, red-eyed and exhausted, playing his role in the ceremony with the dignity expected of him. Charlotte's daughters were there, veiled in black, holding hands for support. Her sons came, all of them, the ones who had disappointed her, and the ones who had tried to please her, united for this one final ceremony. The bishop spoke words of comfort and hope, about resurrection and eternal life, about a faithful servant going to her reward. But the words felt hollow against the reality of loss, against the cold fact of the coffin being lowered into the vault, of Charlotte being sealed away in darkness, away from the gardens she had loved, away from the music and flowers and all the small pleasures that had sustained her. They buried her in the royal vault beneath St. George's Chapel, in the space that had been waiting for her, next to where George would eventually lie. The vault was cold and dark, lit only by the candles the mourners carried, the stone walls pressing close, the air heavy with damp. One by one, the mourners filed past the coffin, paying their final respects, saying silent goodbyes. Then they climbed the stairs back to the chapel, back to the light and warmth, leaving Charlotte in the darkness below. Decades of duty and disappointment and endurance. The Prince Regent returned to his apartments after the funeral and wept. Whatever their differences, whatever disappointments had marked their relationship, she had been his mother. She had held him as a baby, had taught him his letters, had tried in her flawed way to prepare him for the role he would inherit, and now she was gone, and he was truly alone with the weight of the crown. Charlotte's daughters dispersed to their own residences, carrying with them the jewelry and keepsakes their mother had left them. They would live on for many more years, Augusta until 1840, Mary until 1857, surviving into the reign of their niece Victoria, living links to a past that seemed impossibly distant. King George lived on in his madness for another 14 months. The attendants who cared for him maintained their routine, feeding him and dressing him and preventing him from harm. He played his harpsichord, the notes sometimes beautiful, sometimes discordant. He walked in the gardens when the weather was fine, escorted by servants who made sure he did not wander too far. In January 1820, George grew suddenly ill. The madness that had protected him from the knowledge of Charlotte's death could not protect him from the failure of his own body. He weakened rapidly, his breathing labored, his heart struggling. On the morning of January 29, 1820, King George III died in his bed at Windsor. He was 81 years old and had been king for nearly 60 years. The longest reigning British king up to that point. Though his granddaughter Victoria would eventually surpass him, they carried him to the vault where Charlotte waited and laid him beside her in death, as he had lain beside her in life. Together again, the king and queen who had loved each other through everything, who had produced a dynasty, who had tried to be good rulers and good people, and had succeeded and failed in equal measure. The Prince Regent became King George IV, finally ascending to the throne he had been waiting to inherit for so long, but the crown brought him no happiness. He reigned for 10 years, increasingly unpopular, increasingly isolated, dying at 67, bloated and sick from decades of excess. The succession passed to his brother Frederick, who became King William IV. But Frederick had no legitimate children either, only the 10 illegitimate ones he had fathered with his actress mistress. When he died in 1837, the crown passed at last to Charlotte's granddaughter, to the child she had never met, to Victoria. Queen Victoria ascended the throne at 18, a young woman who had grown up knowing she would be queen, who had been carefully educated and prepared for the role. She would reign for 63 years, giving her name to an age, transforming the monarchy and the nation, becoming the longest reigning British monarch until Elizabeth II surpassed her in the 21st century. And Victoria remembered her grandmother Charlotte, the woman she had never known, but whose influence had shaped the world Victoria inherited. The Christmas trees that Victoria made famous, photographed with her family gathered around them, singing carols and exchanging gifts, was Charlotte's tradition, brought from Germany and planted in British soil. The charitable work that Victoria championed, the idea that royalty had a duty to help those in need, was Charlotte's innovation, her belief that privilege came with responsibility. The emphasis on family life, on being a devoted spouse and parent, was modeled on the marriage of Charlotte and George, on their preference for domestic happiness over courtly intrigue. The gardens at Kew that Victoria visited and supported, that became one of the world's great botanical institutions, had been started by Charlotte, expanded by her passion for plants and growing things. The Strelitzia Regina still bloomed there in the glasshouses, its orange and blue flowers as extraordinary as ever, named for a queen who had been dead for decades, but whose love of botany lived on. Buckingham Palace, which Victoria made the official royal residence, had been bought for Charlotte as the Queen's house, a private retreat where she could escape the formality of court. Victoria transformed it as her needs required, but the bones of the building, the rooms where Charlotte had given birth to most of her children. In this way, Charlotte's influence persisted long after her death, woven into the fabric of British royal life so thoroughly that it became invisible, simply the way things were done. The traditions she had begun, the precedents she had set, the choices she had made, all of them rippling forward through time, shaping the lives of people she would never meet. The gardens she had planted at Windsor continued to grow and evolve, tended by new gardeners who knew her name but had never seen her face. The trees she had introduced reached full maturity, their branches spreading wide, providing shade for visitors who walked the paths she had once walked. The Christmas trees that appeared in British homes every December, decorated with lights and ornaments, crowned with stars or angels, were her gift to the nations, a piece of German tradition that had become so thoroughly British that most people did not know its origin. The debutante balls that shaped London society for another century and a half, that determined marriages and alliances and the structure of the upper classes, had begun with Charlotte's birthday ball in 1780, with those first young women curtsying before her in their hoop skirts and ostrich feathers. The philanthropic work that became central to the royal family's public image, that defined how monarchy related to the people it served, had been Charlotte's choice, her decision to use her position to help those who suffered. These were not small things, they were the ways one life touches others, the ways a single person's choices can shape culture and tradition, can influence how people live and think and organize their societies. Charlotte had been queen for 57 years, and in that time she had left marks that would not fade, but beyond the public legacy, beyond the traditions and institutions, there was something else. The story of a human being who lived and loved and suffered, who tried to do her best in impossible circumstances, who made mistakes and regretted them, who endured loss after loss and somehow kept going. The girl from Mecklenburg who had crossed the sea, the young bride meeting her husband at a garden gate, the mother of 15 children, some living, some dead, all of them carrying pieces of her forward into the future. The widow of a mad king staying faithful through everything. The grandmother who doted on a girl who would die too young. The old woman in the garden, watching light on water, knowing her time was ending. This was Queen Charlotte. Not just the traditions and the legacy, not just the historical facts and dates, but the lived experience of a woman who was born and died, who laughed and wept, who planted gardens and lost children, who found love and watched it slip away into madness, who did her duty for nearly 6 decades, and then finally was allowed to rest. The vault beneath St. George's Chapel at Windsor holds her still, the stone cold, the darkness absolute. But the life she lived echoes forward through time in ways both seen and unseen, in Christmas trees and botanical gardens, in charitable foundations and royal traditions, in the simple fact that she was here, that she mattered, that her choices shaped the world. And perhaps that is enough, not to be perfect, not to succeed at everything, not to avoid all mistakes and regrets, but to live fully, to love deeply, to endure through difficulty, to leave something behind that has value, to plant gardens that bloom long after the gardener has gone, to begin traditions that comfort and connect people across generations, to be remembered not just as a title or a role, but as a person who lived and whose life meant something. Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, born May 19, 1744, died November 7, 1818, Queen Consort of Great Britain and Ireland for 57 years, mother of 15 children, planter of gardens, introducer of Christmas trees, patron of music and botany, faithful wife to a mad king, flawed mother to troubled children, complicated woman who tried her best in circumstances not of her choosing. Her story is complete now, told as fully as we can tell it across the distance of more than 2 centuries, the facts we know and the spaces we can only imagine, the public record and the private experience. The woman and the queen, both and neither, complicated and human and real. The wind still moves through the gardens at Windsor, rustling leaves, bending grass, indifferent to the passage of time. The Strelitzia regnae still blooms in the glass houses at Kew, its flowers opening season after season. The Christmas trees still appear each December, lit and decorated, gathering families around them. The traditions continue, the legacy persists, the story endures, and beneath the chapel in the darkness of the vault, Charlotte rests beside George, together at last after all the years of separation, all the pain of his madness and her grief. The stone is cold and the silence absolute, but perhaps there is peace there too, the peace of completed things, of stories told and lives lived and duties done. The tale of Queen Charlotte reaches its end here, in the quiet darkness of the vault, in the ongoing life of the traditions she began, in the gardens that bloom, and the music that plays, and the memories that persist. She lived, she mattered, she left her mark. And in the end, what more can any of us do?